Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the Southland Regional 30 by 30 Power and Nature Coalition meeting, and we have our guest speaker today is Charles Thomas, who's with Outward Bound Adventures. I'll give a little bit of history. He's got quite an extensive history of really cool jobs, but he's got some important things to say. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but Charles has spent his entire life promoting diversity and inclusion in the outdoor world and is presently the executive director of Outward Bound Adventures. You attended Southern Oregon University and got 2 degrees in physical geography and environmental studies. It's always nice to meet another geographer. But you have quite a bit of information to share, and I think some of your own personal history weaves into that very dearly, because your descent includes a mixture of really cool features. So African American, Japanese, and Native American descent. So you bring a lot of important buckets into this arena. So thank you. And today you're going to talk about the 4 justices and promoting diversity and equity in conservation. And I know you have some fantastic programs that I know you're going to talk about as well. So for everyone that's joining, you're all muted so that we have a clear connection with Charles. And Charles, I'll go ahead and share the screen here, and you just let me know when it's time to transition the slides.
Sure. We're not gonna. Oh, okay. Yeah, you can just leave that slide up. So welcome everybody. I'm glad and happy to be talking to my compatriots here, my comrades in arms in terms of what we're trying to do in promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and actually access in the conservation arena. So I just want to start out with 4 questions that should precede any DEI efforts. And then I'm going to go over the 4 justices, as Mel just said, and explain how the conservation movement has become and remains very much homogeneous by answering those questions that arise out of the 4 justices. After that, I want to talk to you about 4 major people of color outdoor user categories that have been created through my 45 years of work and what OBA has been doing, Outward Bound Adventures is doing. And then finally, I'm going to discuss the 5 programs of OBA and our techniques, some of our models, and how OBA has been connecting the low-income communities of color to the nature, conservation movement, and the environmental movement for the last 62 years. And then that is what my book, so this is my shameless plug, From the Hood to the Woods, is all about. It's about highlighting those 45 years of developing programs that have multiple evidence-based techniques for promoting and increasing diversity and access to nature and conservation, especially for marginalized and historically absent communities. So let's jump right into the 4 questions. These are the 4 questions that must be asked anytime anybody wants to become a little bit more diverse. Those are the 4 justices, but the 4 questions are preceding that. But thanks for bringing those up, Mel. That's what we're going to go right into. Is the 4 questions are: why do you want to become more diverse? Because a lot of people, you can leave it up good. I know someone's listening to me. Why do you want to become diverse? That question has to be asked all the time. How will you achieve it in your organization? What will more diversity and equity look like to you in your organization when it's achieved? And how will you sustain it? So when answering these questions, you have to bear in mind this fact. This fact is really critical, that actually there is no empirical evidence that simply diversifying your organization or your workforce will lead to making your organization any better. I want to underscore that. There's just no empirical evidence that says, okay, we're going to simply diversify and it's going to make our organization better. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary that shows that diversifying your organization very well might lead to decreased organizational effectiveness unless 3 critical changes happen. And those changes are: your leadership must create a psychologically safe workplace for minorities and different identity groups. And that safe workplace has to seek out and destroy systems of discrimination and learn how to embrace different styles of communication from those different identity groups. The second thing is you must have 30% or higher of your staff must come from diverse backgrounds. And the third thing is your organization has to be willing to reshape its power structure. And we don't have time to go into all three of those things today. Some of those things are in my book, but also I would encourage you to write any questions you have down about that, and you can contact me directly. All right, so let's go into the 4 justices. Thank you, Mel, for holding off on that. There are 4 critical justices that have to be addressed when you're talking about increasing DEI. And the first one is distributive justice. And distributive justice really refers to the perceived fairness of an allocation, or more broadly, how people judge what they receive. So that's the first justice. The second one is, but the question attached to distributive justice, before I go to the second one, is what majority demographic has the most access to trails, wilderness, conservation, education, and outdoor jobs? It's sitting right there in front of you. Think about that question, and I'm sure that most of you can, right off the top, answer that question. The second one is interactional justice. And that really is about the degree to which people affected by any decision around conservation are treated with dignity and respect. Now, those 2 terms are sort of emotionally loaded, and it means something to each individual. However, there is across the board understanding of what dignity and respect mean. The third justice is representational justice, but I'm encouraging you guys to read the questions underneath in the slide. What majority demographic has been responsible for making others feel welcome and wanted in outdoor spaces? And that's interactional justice. And the third is representational justice. And again, what majority demographic historically has interpreted the land, told the stories of the land, and the histories of the land. And the fourth is procedural justice. And procedural justice is an all-encompassing sort of justice that has to be applied, that includes the 4 pillars of procedural justice, which are fairness, impartiality, transparency, and giving voice. So of those 4 justices, all of those things need to be applied and considered and thought about when you are attempting to do DEI work within your organization, or even just your own personal DEI work. Okay, so let's go to people of color outdoor user categories. I said I would go over people of color outdoor user categories. So there are the INUs, those are intentional non-users. And those are the folks that I'm not interested, thank you. Okay, I'm not interested in going outdoors. There are the NINUs, the non-intentional non-users, and they don't intentionally avoid the outdoors. And in fact, they'll go out if someone takes them out. They just don't know where to go and what to do when they get outdoors. So this is typically the largest category. If you put them on a bell curve, this is typically the largest category where most folks of color actually reside. And I'm talking about the demographic. So we've worked with nearly 100,000 people of color, and we've determined that they fall into these 4 categories. The third category is the NIUs, the non-intentional users, and they kind of get swept along with the party crowd, and they're glad they did. They tend to believe that camping and outdoor activities are a white thing, and they don't really identify with it, but they'll go if asked to, and they wind up enjoying it. And then the last one are what a lot of us are they're the IUs, are the intentional users, and they are purposely seeking out outdoor and nature-based recreation. This is a smaller group of people of color, but growing quickly. Now, remember, I have the benefit of kind of like David Attenborough. I'm not nearly as old as David Attenborough, but the benefit of 45 years of leading wilderness trips and nature-based programs. And so I have seen that curve growing in certain areas. Do we have a slide of the curve, Mel? Is there? there should be a slide of the curve right there. It is. Okay. So you can see, for those of you that are watching here, where most environmental conservation organizations are going to engage the underserved. They're in those last two categories on the left, which are the non-intentional users. They typically go out because of an invitation, and intentional users. But they are a very small group of folks when compared to the non-intentional, or the NINUs, the non-intentional non-users, and the intentional non-users, which is a little bit larger than is shown on this curve. This is my curve, but it has to be updated. It says 2023, but I actually created this curve back in the 2018, 2019. But because of the year, they just updated the date. So anyway, that's people of color outdoor user categories. And there's a lot more that goes into this, like understanding axiology, understanding epistemology, which is how value is added to different ethnic groups, and how their way of knowing, coming to know the outdoors. Those are two very critical items I'm not going to talk about today. It's talked about in my book, and it's, I'll talk about a little bit about it in the actual programs. So let's actually see a video of some NINUs and some NIUs and some INUs. I can never get used to saying those words, but let's actually see some non-intentional non-users and non-intentional users and intentional non-users. Let's hear it straight from them. These are people that are part of our programs. Some of them are from our environmental restoration crew members, and some of them are youth in our programs. Do you have that slide?
I do.
Okay.
Why
So
I
the
haven't been
question-
out in the outdoors is because I was scared of the animals in the wilderness. But since I've been with OBA, I've been camping 2 times with a tent, the bears, and everybody.
Because I don't really like bugs.
Because I'm always working.
When I was a freshman, we went camping for a field trip, and I had really fun. And if I had a chance to go again, I would.
I don't know where to go, and I don't know what to do.
I don't go as often as I wish I could, but I have gone hiking and I have gone mountain bike riding. But the reason I don't go as often is because my mom is very overprotective of us, and she thinks it's very dangerous for us to go.
Because I don't really have the time to. I play sports, so I don't really. I have practice every single weekend, practice every single day. I don't really have the time to, but I would love to go out in the wilderness sometime, or go camping, hiking, or anything like that.
I saw being outdoors as like a luxury, like a vacation, so I've never really went out camping with my family before. But since joining OBA, I've been able to get outdoors more, and I realized how it is an essential. You have to be outside for your mental health, to connect back to nature.
And I don't really enjoy long car rides, so I don't go as often, but I do when I can.
Because I don't like going out that much, but I do like, getting dirty in the mountains. But it's just hard because I don't like getting eaten by bears.
I don't go into the wilderness because I don't have a lot of free time on my hands. And during the weekdays, like I have school and I play sports. But if I did have more time on the weekdays where I don't have sports, then I would go out into the wilderness.
The reason why a lot of POC, brown or black people don't go out to camping is because the resources were designed for white people to use and not for us to use, and so that narrative has to change, and we have to be willing to go out there and explore and figure out.
That's all right. I think I think that's Javier. I think he's the last one anyway now, but I'll pick it up from there. So that's hearing it straight from the NINUs, the INUs, and the other U's that we have there. I want you to notice though that Javier, the last guy on there, he said that the resources were designed for white people. You cannot design the wilderness for a particular ethnic group. What he meant by that is, if you go into areas, there are Latino families, Asian families, Arab families, even Black and even Native American families. They tend to want to be in groups, and there is, if you're going into a park or anywhere that has structures, they tend not to have big group or larger group areas out in the wilderness and in conservation. He was talking a little bit about that, but they tend to want to have more amenities like a bathroom or some place where they can buy something. So there's a conflict, an inherent conflict when we talk about serving all of the groups, especially if you're a pure preservationist or conservationist that says, no, look, this just leave the land the way it is. So that's another argument, but I wanted you folks to hear, these are folks that are now getting out through our program, and we have hundreds and hundreds of folks that we're serving that are saying the same things, and that's how we're able to develop that bell curve. But let's talk about, okay, how are we serving those people? I think that's really critical, and I want to wrap up with how are we serving those people and talk to you folks about some of the tools that we use. So if we can start on our program slides in a second, Mel, but I would just want to say that our programs are really based on what we call the vowel principle of conservation. And we call it the vowel principle for one very simple reason. It's because it's the vowels, A-E-I-O-U, right? And within those vowels, so our programs are all designed around A-E-I-O-U, and you'll find out what those vowels mean in a second. We use 5 techniques that we use to promote and sustain DEI within our programs. And I didn't say this up front, but you may have read it or seen it somewhere, but OBA is the oldest nonprofit in the United States that's been dedicated to serving underserved audiences of color, urban audiences of color. And 62 years and counting. We are not part of the other Outward Bound. In fact, we're the only organization in the world that can keep Outward Bound in our name because we were created before them. We have done partnerships, and at one time we were an affiliate of Outward Bound, but we started before them, and it's always been dedicated to getting people of color connected to the outdoors. And a big push of ours is about getting connected to careers in conservation. So we use 5 techniques to promote and sustain DEI. We have a technique called linked program matriculation, meaning all our programs are linked and there's multiple access points to get into our programs. We also use a technique called MOCA, and that just means multiple opportunities for consistent access. So when someone comes into our program, it's not just, oh, okay, it's a one and done, they get to go on a hike and then we'll see you whenever we can. There are multiple opportunities within our programs that our folks have consistent access to the outdoors through our linked program matriculation. And then we have a model, a behavioral model that we use also that we train our staff in. And it's a very simple model. It's called DEVO, and not the music group from the 80s, but DEVO, it means directly engaged with vigilant oversight. And the philosophy there is we're not doing the work. They're doing everything it takes to get outdoors. We're only directly engaged with oversight and leading them, because the philosophy is that if you do it, they won't do it for themselves most of the time. They won't know how to do it. And so it's really big in OBA is that we teach them how to do it and they do it themselves. And we're just with oversight, and we train our staff that very same way. And the fourth one is that we use something called forced opportunity, which is causing a lot of consternation with some of our latest incoming staff. We have about, after this class graduates, we have 80 field instructors. And this current class of field instructors, all of color, they're putting up a couple of which is true to millennials too. Most of them are millennials. They're saying, why do you call it forced opportunity? We're not comfortable with the force. So we're looking at that and trying to figure out the best way to change it. But basically forced opportunity is if you're going into that far end of the bell curve, and you're especially going into the non-intentional users, you don't want them to be able to say, no, I'm not going out. So forced opportunity is really helping them to understand, listen, you're really missing an opportunity here, and here's why. And so we really don't accept no as the first answer. Otherwise, that entire segment of the bell curve wouldn't get out, at least the ones that we're working with. So we use something called forced opportunity, and it's a series of connections and relationships with parents, multiple in-face visits or in-person visits and phone calls, and really helping them to understand that they're missing out on an opportunity. And then the last thing, of course, we use, I just told you about our staff. Your staff must look like the youth that you serve, and they should come from the same communities, because there's understanding the daily context of young people of color's lives is super critical. And just the fact that young people of color take great pride in them being of color is really critical. And so you must have staff that understand that. All right, so we're going to go into these slides real quick. How much time do we have, Mel? I'm sorry, I didn't time this talk.
Yeah, so we're at 11:24. So if we have maybe 5 more minutes or so.
Okay, all right, I got a minute per slide.
All right.
Oh, okay. So we have a program called the Youth Advisory Council. And so that's about access. It's all about access, teaching these young people how to access the outdoors. A couple of years ago, our youth were up in the Angeles National Forest, and a ranger's vendor came up to him and said, "What are you kids doing up there?" They're all black and brown kids. So, "What are you kids doing up there?" And they said, "Well, we're hiking, we're having fun." And the ranger's vendor had the temerity to tell our kids and our staff, I won't clean up his language. He said, "Get the fuck out of here. This is Trump country." Now, this just happened a couple of years ago, right? And so what do our staff and what do our kids feel like when that's the kind of welcoming party that they get? Anyway, we read the Forest Service, the Riot Act, and we're still having a discussion around that. But the Youth Advisory Council is all about access, teaching them how to access it and getting them out again and again and again. The next slide, please, Mel. Our next slide should be our environmental restoration teams, and that's engagement and education. So there's the E, right? There's A is for access, engagement and education. So one time we were walking along the beach of Malibu Lagoon, picking up trash with our folks, and this person came by, and she's a well-intentioned white woman. She came by and she threw the trash down on the ground in front of one of our kids, and with the expectation that they would pick it up. I mean, she just couldn't hand it to them. She just couldn't pick it up. And up until that time, our kids were okay with it. And then one of the kids looked at me and said, "Why are we out here picking up this trash for these white folks? I never see them in Compton picking up our trash," And so you have to engage them and you have to educate them in a way that's going to help them understand what stewardship is about, right? And that their time is worth money, and taking care of their nature is worth their time. And it cannot be in conflict with where you are and what you're doing and who you're doing it. Because this is a demographic that typically doesn't do much volunteer work. So A is for access. Yeah, E is for engagement and education. Okay, next slide. So that's our second program. Our third program is Teach Me to Camp. A father called me up not too long ago, and he was in tears, and he said, "I have to talk to you about my daughter." And I said, "Oh my God, what happened out there?" Because he was on a Teach Me to Camp. But what he wanted to tell me is that he had never knew that his daughter wanted to be an astronaut. He didn't know that his daughter wanted to go spend more time camping. They'd never done that. So our Teach Me to Camp program is really a camping education program where we teach them how to use all of the gear, and we give them gear if they want to go out again. But two things we focus on is values clarification and goal setting, because we want them to develop an identity with their parents outdoors. That's super important, because when you have you engage people in a novel setting, they will remember it, especially if they're with their parents. A case in point is, if I asked you where you were on May 15th, 2021, you probably couldn't tell me. However, if I asked you where you were on September the 11th, 2001, you could tell me right where you were, because that was a very emotional day for most of America. And so we're trying to not create that type of disaster, but what we are trying to do is to create that type of emotion. Okay, we can go to the next one. And the next one is for O. So that one's for identity, I, and the next slide is O for opportunity. The strangest thing is when you take kids out on long environmental studies expeditions, because these things go actually from 1 day to 28 days now, they start recognizing the value of these opportunities when they're out there working, they're making money, and they're coming to understand themselves in a different place. So these expeditions are super critical. It's one thing to be able to take them out on a 1-day hike. It's another thing to keep them out for 14 days, 15 days. And it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of experience, but these are where we have the most impact. On one of our recent trips, a ranger called me up from the National Park Service and said, I want you to know that a couple came over complaining about your group and they asked to be escorted out of the park. And I said, what did our group do? And he said, absolutely nothing. They were just afraid of being around Black and brown people in this park. This is way up north. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I escorted them out. And I said, who? And he said, the couple that needed to get out, not your group. And so that changed the way these 15 kids on that particular course saw opportunity, that the Park Service was open to them. And the last slide is you. And this is really understanding staff are really finding that unicorn where people say, oh my God, there's just no qualified staff of color. Well, we've created our own institute to train staff of color. And to date, we've trained hundreds and hundreds of staff of color to work in these communities. So when people say, like I got a phone call from the Sierra Club, and this woman was questioning if white people were even welcomed at Dolly, and why were we focused solely on training people of color? And I said to her, well, white people are welcome, but they must have one particular skill set, and that must be sustained experience working in communities of color. That makes them inexperienced if they don't have that, because that's who we work with. So I asked her a question. I said, were people of color excluded from working in the Sierra Club? And she said, of course not. And then I said, then why was it the Sierra Club at that time was 89% white? She said, well, quite honestly, people of color don't seem to be interested in the Sierra Club, and there just aren't enough people of color out there. Well, there are. You're just not looking for them. They're not the unicorns that most people think. There are a lot of people of color out there, and you can't hire with the same mindset that they have to be like all the other folks. You must understand that you can hire on potential sometimes, and it depends on where you're recruiting, how you're recruiting, and who's doing the recruiting. People, young people of color need to have staff who look like them and understand them. That doesn't mean that if you're not a person of color that you cannot do this work. So let me close with this. Do the good work of conservation, but always be mindful of the existing structural dynamics that have made conservation exclusive, and work to reverse those dynamics. Remember, there are 3 critical changes that must happen to diversify the movement. First one is leadership has to create that psychologically safe space, a workplace for minorities, destroy those systems of discrimination, and embrace styles of communication that are different from from different identity groups. The second thing is 30% or higher of the staff must come from diverse backgrounds. And the third thing is your organization must be willing to reshape its power structure. I know I talked fast. I'm willing to answer any questions that you have. Thank you for listening to me. I appreciate it. Melanie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we do have a couple of questions that were submitted in advance, but I'll encourage folks to go ahead and add questions to the chat. And if we have a moment, we will make sure to read through those. So one question that came in directly to you is about your experiences in your childhood that brought you to where you are today in the conservation movement, and whether or not there was a particular person or a moment that stands out for you.
There was actually, I share this in the first chapter of the book. I got in a lot of trouble as a teenager. In fact, I was incarcerated for almost 2 years for some of the stuff that I did. The state gave me a vacation and they fed me for nearly 2 years. Actually, it was, I think it was 18 months, but nonetheless, when I was sitting in my room, because I was a juvenile at that time, when I was sitting in my room, I had already gone on one OBA trip during that time. And I reflected back on that trip and I said, here in this room, this little 8x10 room, there in the Eastern High Sierras. And so I didn't quite say at that time I was going to dedicate my life to conservation. What I did do is say there's extreme freedom in being outdoors, and there's a poverty of freedom when you're locked up in or that you don't know about the outdoors. And at that time, I started shifting my thinking. I was very young. I think I was 14 or 15, shifting my thinking to about how can we engage more people? And this was all through this organization that I now run. I do want to say that I did go on to become, an ecologist for the Army Corps of Engineers. I was an environmental scientist for a consulting firm. I was a regional ranger for the National Park Service for 5 years, and I ran an environmental division for a municipality. All of those things stem from my early days of just getting taken out of the city and into the outdoors.
Sounds like some very formative years for you.
They were very
So as it relates specifically to 30 by 30, how do you see the intersection of the 30 by 30 goals, which are equity, climate resilience, and biodiversity? Do you think it's possible to meet all three of those, or is it simply a dream?
No, I don't think it's a dream at all. I think for justices with a particular focus on procedural justice need to be paid close attention to. I mean, we have Chuck Sands in the Park Service, we have Deb Haaland at the Interior, we had Obama, who talked a lot. I mean, I was very fortunate to be invited to the White House to watch him sign the Great Outdoor Initiative, who was very, even the president himself, the former president himself, was very interested in understanding the connection. So they know about these things. And I do not think this is a dream at all. I see so much movement and so much activity, especially in communities of color, but more importantly, by allies, by our white allies that are saying, come on, we need your help. They understand that the effectiveness of any movement, it depends on the broadness of its base and its foundation. And so I do not, that's an excellent question. I see it as an absolute essential part of conservation and engaging diversity, climate change, climate resilience, and biodiversity, all a big part of what we do at our organization. So I think it's absolutely essential and very doable.
Excellent. Well, we're going to be looking to leaders like you to help some of us figure that out. What's one thing that each one of us can do as individuals to bring about change as it relates to the justices that you recounted? And you already mentioned what organizations can do, so we'll focus on individuals.
I think that individuals can do particularly one thing, especially if you are an ally, is really align yourself with groups of color and sort of use your ability to and understanding to help that group of color. And I don't mean direct them, but help them to become part of the larger movement wherever you are and what you're doing. But I think that, and I think that to understand that there is a system that's already been built, not by any of you, but the conservation movement stems way, way back. And it's a system that wasn't necessarily built for people of color and designed to engage people of color. And I think it's absolutely critical that individuals understand that while they didn't build the system, they can be part of a system and help to change it and really understand that the system, don't expect some people to endorse a system that they had played a very small role in, and help open up the roles that people can play, especially people of color in that system as an individual by being an ally.
Excellent, great tips. Last question of the pre-submitted ones. And it was interesting that I think the first gal interviewed in the video mentioned this, that she was kind of afraid of nature, of bugs and things like that, and getting eaten by bears. How do we combat the stereotypes that seem to be consistently played in the media or on TV or shows, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm so pissed off about these wilderness survival shows and all that. I think it's the biggest crock of BS I've ever seen. You know, but we combat it by getting young folks out. That's the whole forced opportunity. You get them out and let them experience it. I think it's absolutely critical that they really experience the outdoors and let them decide for themselves. But you have talented staff that can really, it's really hard to destroy something that you understand, right? And they it's our job to teach them how to understand the outdoors. And it's, you know, it's done in a way that's very passive, but being there and letting them wander in nature. But I think the way that we combat is just get more and more folks connected to the outdoors in a very passive way that they can identify with.
Excellent. And Dan, I see you have a question, and we'll try to get to one more in the chat and then get those answered later if we don't hit them up. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Charles. Dan Silver, Endangered Habitats League. Enjoyed your impressive presentation. We work with the Earth Discovery Institute in San Diego. It does some related work. On the 30-30, as you know, access is is one of the goals of the program in a formal way. I've had a hard time putting in my own mind, what do we mean when something is accessible physically? You know, what makes an open space accessible, particularly to disadvantaged communities? What sort of, are we talking about a distance? Are we talking about a transportation mode? Are we talking about as individuals or through an organized effort? Could you help me understand what might be a working definition?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Great question. I think that accessibility and access means something different to each group that you're working with. Because the flip side of access is barriers, okay? And what barriers are keeping people from going out. So look at the 4 justices. Have they created any barriers? That's the first thing, because I remember clearly going into a park where a ranger didn't want our group to be in there because it was an all African-American group. And he thought that we didn't know what we were doing and we were probably going to wind up dying out on the trail or something like that. And he'd have to come in and save us. So he was a barrier to our access until he understood, oh, these people have been doing this for a long time. They know what they're doing. But so it could be transportation. It could be financial. It could be, not feeling welcome. But right now, I think more than anything is helping people understand that it's out there. Those people, especially on the other side of the bell curve, that it's out there and it's available and it's part of what you can do. Now, how you do that? What's a group that you work with in San Diego, Dan? What did you say?
Earth Discovery Institute.
Earth Discovery. So are you guys working with a demographic that traditionally has not had access?
Yeah. We actually have a program with the school districts, and so we use buses to transport youth to a preserve that's probably 30 minutes away, 20-30 minutes away, say from Chula Vista or the South Bay.
Yeah, we're doing work there too, actually. Yeah, we run courses down in that area, but so the access piece for you guys is because it seems like you're doing some of the work. Where does the access piece, where do you get hung up on the access piece?
Right. Well, in the 30-by-30, the goal is to provide access to disadvantaged communities in particular. And does that mean that the outdoor area should be adjacent, directly, physically adjacent? Should it be walkable? Should it be in a certain radius of an automobile trip? Is it just in the region, where you could get to it, within an hour? I mean, how do you look at this geographic component of it to determine whether the money spent on an acquisition, for example, actually meets the accessibility criteria?
Well, I think one of the first things that I would start out with is, you got to come to understand, especially if you're working in an inner city, urban community, that access means something very different to a rural community where there might be a preserve within walking distance to someone. So it's understanding sort of the demographic, and then recognizing, like under 30 by 30, recognizing that a lot of people are getting a lot of money for acquisition and claiming that they're going to provide access, but that is not necessarily true, because there's so many people that don't know that exists. It's not the old land trusts, sort of bucks for acres deal anymore and remain quiet, and that's just a preserve. It's now about getting out there into these groups, these disadvantaged groups, and letting them know this exists and here's the way to get to it. And that is one sure way of providing access, which is because if you're working with a group in Watts in South LA, their nearest access to open space might be 45 minutes away in the Santa Monica Mountains. So how do you provide access for that group as opposed to a group that's in Delano, right, where the nearest preserve is only 5 minutes away? So it really does depend on who you're working with, but I think the access issue is more about education and saying, here's how you get to this, and here's what's available.
So what I'm hearing is more of a functional definition rather than some sort of metric that's based on distance. It's more, how does it work in real life? Functionally. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And that worn out adage, meeting people where they are. Some people can get there, some people cannot. So yeah, I think it's really about indexing all these access points and then putting them out there for people to understand this is for you too, and here's how you get there.
Charles, thank you so much. I'm aware of the time, so let's just do one last question. What's the name of your book and when's it due out?
It's due out the end of this year, and it's called From the Hood to the Woods.
All right, From the Hood to the Woods. So we will make sure to share that when we get it, and hopefully you'll do some type of book signing and we can all show up to support you.
Would love that. Love to see everybody there.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll move on to the rest of the Southland meeting then.